In 1991, a country was born of blood. It was built from the rubble of what many consider to be Africa's worst civil war, driven from a genocide the entire world ignored. It has 3.5 million citizens, and its expats live in almost every major nation on Earth. And yet, I wouldn't be surprised if you'd never even heard its name. After all, you won't see it on your maps because your map maker doesn't believe it exists. You won't hear your government praise its successes or denounce its failures because your government doesn't admit it exists either. You won't learn about it in school or hear about it on the news because nobody, absolutely nobody, seems to admit that this country exists. And yet, here I am, sitting on its roofs, paying with its currency, meeting its doctors. This is definitely a country. The real question is, why won't we admit it? This episode is not about the history of Somalia or the civil war that destroyed the country. For more information on that, I'll be releasing a second video called the Hargeisa Holocaust. No, today's video is just meant to answer one simple question. Is Somaliland a country? Even asking the question alone is a threat to my life. When I mentioned online I was visiting Hargeisa, before I even said a single thing about the videos I intended to make, I was sent death threats. Simply coming here was enough to have people threaten to murder me and my family because they suspected if I visited, I'd say things they didn't want said. And honestly, they're probably right. But what I found most interesting about it was that those who'd claimed to want me dead weren't your typical extremist. They lived in Western countries and were raised predominantly in North American school systems. They weren't the uneducated masses. They weren't Al-Shabaab. But my point in telling you this isn't to garner sympathy for myself. Getting threats in this line of work is nothing new. I mention it because I want to make it clear that an independent Somaliland isn't a topic that people take lightly. You may have never heard of the country, but to many people around the world, it's worth dying for. Perhaps more, it's worth killing for. And yet, even with that weighing on my mind, I suspect that neither side of the conflict is going to be too happy with me when I'm done. Because although I do truly believe in an independent Somaliland, I'm not entirely supportive of what they've done with their independence. They're a nation living in the doorstep of legitimacy, and their survival is dependent on convincing the world that they exist. But over the last few years, they've fallen into the same traps of that dictatorship that led them to rebel. To explain what I mean, let me take you back for a second. In 1960, the two newly independent states of British and Italian Somaliland merged to become an ethnically driven superstate. Their intention was to put aside clan differences and create a country that could stand up to their larger, independent neighbors. In their grand vision, Djibouti, the Ogaden, and North Kenya would follow in turn. Once they saw the glory of a pan-Somali state, how could they help but fight to join it? Yet, nothing is ever so simple. Agreements are only as good as the people who create them, and the unity that was on every politician's tongue wasn't exactly on their mind. Less than a decade after the two ex-colonies united, a Southern-backed army murdered the president and took the entire country by force. While they claimed their intent was to stop clanism, the reality is that they only intended to stop those who didn't support them. Those clans that now found themselves outside the inner circle would almost immediately feel the effects. Although they shared a single ethnicity and had fought together against their neighbors for thousands of years, the reality is that the Somali people had never really been united. The agreement of 1960 that had combined them into a unified nation was a very ambitious test, a dream being forced to serve as a foundation for reality. But for all the statecraft underway, the clans that dominated the nation had seen little cause to change. Power sharing only works if those with power are intent to share. With their autonomy threatened, once independent regions almost immediately began to reimagine themselves as autonomous. And in that clan division, the newly minted nation of Somalia began to crumble almost as soon as it began. In the north, the Isaaq clan had ruled for hundreds of years. They stretched from the Ogaden in Ethiopia up into Djibouti and across Somaliland. Be it British imperialism, Somali unification, or an independent democracy, the heads of the Isaaq would always expect to remain in power. They were the dominant group. They had the historic ties, and it was their wealth that would keep things stable in their lands. Going against them, in effect, would be akin to going against the entire north, whether the smaller clans agreed to it or not. Civil war was inevitable, and less than 30 years after they'd come together, the country saw one of the worst in Africa's history. As he had with all other clans in the country, the dictator gave the Isaaq an ultimatum: surrender or starve. But they had no intent to do either. The binary didn't suit them. They decided to go with the silent third option: resist. By the mid-1980s, acting in parallel to a number of other rebel groups across the nation, the North revolted in a way that couldn't be stopped. They would be independent again, or they would die trying. But the elites of the South weren't going to let them go quietly. The dictator had to act or risk losing his status. But I suspect few realized just how atrocious his response would be. Bare's answer to their rebellion was so vile it has been appropriately nicknamed the Forgotten Genocide. The second and third largest cities in the country were bombed to near total destruction. Prisons were emptied so they could make way for innocent civilians whose only crime was belonging to the wrong clan. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of innocent people were murdered in cold blood. But just because one side is evil doesn't make the other side pure. To their great discredit, the rebels of Somaliland attempted to return the favor. This was war, after all. But despite being unable to act on the same scale as those they opposed, atrocities were felt on both sides. Those that still preached unification in the lands they claimed as theirs would see their wells poisoned and their families executed. The ends were always intended to justify the means. In 1991, the dictator was in exile and Somaliland declared itself independent. They returned to the borders that the British had carved out hundreds of years before and began setting up the trappings of a modern state. Today, their independence is undeniable. The Freedom Index rates them higher than any of their neighbors, including Ethiopia. They've instilled democracy and accepted peaceful transitions between elected officials. They've centralized a bank and created a currency. They've taken part in international diplomatic organizations and entered legal contracts with multinational corporations. They've created an independent military, judicial system, and modern constitution. They even have a tourism industry. They've done virtually everything it takes to call oneself a country. The only thing they lack is recognition. So for over 25 years, Somaliland has been waiting for a nation, any nation, to call them free. And for 25 years, the governments of the world have turned a blind eye. With virtually no money on the table, superpowers simply aren't willing to stick out their necks. And why would they? Despite what Western politicians claim, freedom is not in and of itself a sound political theory. If they publicly supported the people of Somaliland in choosing their own fate, how would that reflect in their own countries? There are many reasons the world rejects the obvious independence of these people. Canada, for example, will never support a breakaway region so long as they have a Quebec. A Spanish politician may hear Somaliland, but they think Catalonia. China punishes any nation that speaks of Tibet or Xinjiang as anything but Han land. And on the continent, the African Union, under an Ethiopian eye, would much prefer Greater Somalia remain unstable. If their separatists can form unique nations, then what stops Ethiopia from dividing into its many disparate parts? And of course, there's always the money. The companies that have immorally wrestled control of Somalia's wealth would prefer not to have a second government to bribe into submission, thanks. The reality is that nobody cares enough about 3 million Somalis to fight for their freedom. We sit at home and watch Black Hawk Down and pretend that it's all a lost cause. But that's just our ignorance. The reality is that there's simply nothing in it for us. Freedom ain't free. But as I said in the beginning, I don't think this episode is going to please anybody. Because although I'm willing to stand here and say that Somaliland is an independent nation, it isn't what it claims to be. It claims to be a functioning democracy, a nation with a constitution, founded on the principles of freedom from oppression and independence for those who desire it. But for many of the minority groups locked within their borders, this isn't a reality that they would recognize. Calling for reunification with Somalia is enough to get a prison sentence. Poets and journalists sit in cells today simply for expressing their political opinion. Massacres of smaller clans have taken place in both the eastern and western regions and will no doubt continue in the absence of international pressure. The principles that drove the Somalilanders to rebel are being repeated by the Somalilanders. No matter what else I say, that can't be ignored. So yes, Somaliland is a country. It deserves to be able to make its own choices about how to govern its land. We, as the international community, should recognize the incredible feats it took to get them here. We should understand what it means when we leave them out in the dark. Oppressing minorities, no matter how awful it is, doesn't negate statehood. Locking up journalists, as much as it pains me to say, doesn't negate statehood. Many states oppress their minorities, and many states have no true freedom of expression. But as I'm sure that many of their citizens will be watching this video, I want to speak to the country directly. If you're a citizen of Somaliland, I want you to take a look in the mirror. You deserve statehood as much as anybody. You don't have to be a perfect nation to be a nation. But if when you look in that mirror, you even for a second see a hint of the ghost of Siad Barre, I want you to realize that there's more to a nation than independence alone. You know what it's like to be oppressed. You know what it's like to have your voice silenced, to be put in jail for your opinion, to be killed for your clan. So take a look at those in Adwal, in Sul and Sanag, those crying out for justice in your own lands. And remember what it was like for you. Don't just be a nation, Somaliland. Be a nation worth supporting. This is Rare Earth. But for the many, I'm just gonna wait for him to slap by.